Dāmas un kungi, sveicam
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you back to the digital conference organized by the Ministry of Finance, Building Anti-Fraud Crowd Immunity. During the first part of the conference, we heard about the significance of the conference of the topic and combating fraud. That's the topic of highest importance, and significant importance was put on preventive measures already during the first part of the conference. Before the violation has happened, also the red flags had been mentioned, so-called. These are the signs that fraud might take place, and now we will speak in more detail during this part of the conference how these red flags can be used to prevent. And perhaps we will also touch upon some COVID-19 related challenges and the impacts on the situation in these hard times, as fraudulent activities are more active during these times. People are weaker. There are different opportunities in these situations. Ladies and gentlemen, the ones who are watching us on YouTube and Facebook, also here on Zoom, I would like to get involved. Thank you for your questions during the first time. You can send them also during the conference on YouTube, Facebook, also in the chat part, in Zoom. And this conference can be followed in Latvian and in English. You can find and make your own joins, Latvian or English version. We have public web streaming as well. The web page of Ministry of Finance, both languages available there. Now let's proceed with the content. This block will be similar in its content. We will begin with different presentations. At the end, we will have a look at the questions. We'll try to conclude things. The first speaker in this block is AFCOS Latvia representative, Ms. Olga Guza, who will speak about the main activities and challenges of AFCOS LV in the protection of EU financial interests in 2021-2022. Olga, the floor is yours. Thank you, Artis. Good morning, all. I will share my presentation. My topic for today's conference is related to the main activities and challenges. But before I start on the main challenges, I would look a bit back historically. So, AFCOS is anti-fraud coordination service developed in every member state. AFCOS Latvia was developed in 2002. We've been working for almost 20 years, and during these years we have tried to do the compulsory tasks, also to take over the good practice from other member states, and also to become good practice examples from our own side. When we try to take over good practice from other countries, we would like to mention two activities. The first important step was we developed the Consultative Council. That's our cooperation network, whereas we work with different institutions. We go to reach our objectives, to combat fraud in Latvia, in the EU. AFCOS Council was developed in 2007. The next important milestone was in 2017. The Cabinet of Ministers approved the first AFCOS strategy, which is now our basis for all the activities. If we speak about the time when we ourselves started to develop good practice, best practice, that's our campaign Fraud Off. That was from 2017 till 2019. And this has been mentioned also by the European Commission in its Knowledge Center as a good practice example from Latvia. And I also have to mention that currently we're working together with Northern Macedonia in Twinning project. That's the EU project. And we share the experience to our North Macedonian colleagues to develop this AFCOS system.
Un tad kā nākamo punktu savā prezentācijā gribu parādīt arī vienu statistikas slaidu. Šeit jūs redzat statistiku par Latvijā konstatētajiem pārkāpumiem 2020. gadā. Un ja mēs paskatāmies uz pirmo grafiku, kur ir redzams pārkāpumu skaits, tad mēs redzam, ka kopējais
2021 and situation in terms of detected or infringement detected.
No visiem šiem pārkāpumiem.
So other breaches, violations, it's more than half. And just 32 cases are related to fraud.
Finanšu ietekmēm, tad šī aina ir jau pavisam citāda, un mēs redzam, ka jau ar krāpšanu ir saistīti 57.
Financial aspect, we can see there's a different picture. Fraud cases are 57%. It means incorrectly or illegal usage of EU funds. It's also the basis why we need such kind of anti-fraud services in each of the member states. And we have to combat fraud intensively, as these fraud violations are quite significant. When we speak about fraud, we also have to mention another aspect, that's undiscovered or undetected fraud. As we can see, this iceberg, this is the lowest part. We can try hard, but unfortunately we cannot detect all the fraud for several reasons. Because this is a fraud activity with intentional background. These schemes, fraud schemes, become also diverse and sophisticated. We can use different IT tools and solutions. Also, people who are involved, they also agree among themselves to make it harder to detect these fraud attempts. And that is, as it was mentioned during the first speech, the lead of AFCOS Council, we concentrate our work on preventive measures, also to diminish this undiscovered fraud. Society has to be aware, society has to be against fraud. But when we speak about the main activities, so the main tool for us we used to fight fraud is our consultative council, AFCOS Consultative Council. And this council, according to the cabinet, to the rules of the cabinet of the minister, consists of several institutions. These are investigation institutions, EU funds, administrative institutions. In addition, experts can join AFCOS also from other competent authorities. And during the last years, more and more experts are joining our council. And currently, the council represents more than 20 institutions. One of the most important activities is the development of AFCOS strategy and implementation of the activities included in the strategy. The strategy is being developed for a period of 3 years, and currently we have the strategy which was approved last year in the Cabinet of Ministers, and it will be in force until 2022. This strategy includes 3 main action lines, and each of them includes also the activities we have committed to implement until the end of the next year. The first direction is cooperation. It's cooperation with the European Public Prosecutor, also with identifying databases which we, the members of the Council, could use to identify frauds, also to avoid the risks of fraud. The second direction is implementation of law, OLAF supporting law. It includes informing the society and the competent institutions about such a law, and also to develop procedures to implement the law. And the third direction is preventive actions. These activities are related to fraud-off initiative or campaign, also cooperation with AFCOS services from other countries, and also between the competent institutions in Latvia. And approaching our main challenges, initially I would like to mention one challenge in terms of cooperation. That's related to typology of fraud, definition of red flags. We have begun this work in cooperation with the Prosecutor's Office and other competent institutions. Our aim is to define fraud, the typology, the schemes which are most commonly used in order to get the EU funds, also to define these characteristics, so-called red flags, to identify that there is risk of fraud, and why do we have to approach investigation institutions to avoid these schemes, to stop them in a timely manner. We will prepare a kind of matrix. You can see one example of typology, and for this typology we will join these criteria, possible descriptions, and this will be a very practical tool that the financial recipients and other players will be able to use, the ones who work with the EU finance projects. And the main objective is to develop tool, matrix, to be used to avoid and stop these fraudulent schemes before they are implemented in practice from the whether from the national budget or from EU budget. Most likely, one of the examples of this matrix will be included on our webpage, that everyone could reach out to it and use it. Another challenge I would like to mention, this is from preventive measures. that's the involvement of society. As it has been mentioned several times, it's important to get society's understanding, mindset against fraudulent activities, and that's why all the activities we implement are very important. So these are different events. So these are AFCOS conferences. So this conference has been informed of the objective to inform society. Another type of activity is fraud off initiative campaign. We also still maintain this initiative, and anyone who's interested can join this movement. So there's also a web address available you can access. And the last tool is also this reporting tool, which is available at Fraud Off website, and any member of society can report on violations or any suspicions on fraud. The tool is interactive, so you can choose the institution you would like report to, and the tool will show also the minimum information that would be useful to be included in your report. And it will be easier to identify and investigate this fraud case. You can also report to us as AFCOS. You can also report anonymously. And we very much welcome these reports, and we look into all of them. That would conclude at this stage. Thank you. So, thank you for the insight and very practical examples.
And the topics that you touched upon and the tools that you mentioned, I think it is very important for the society to actually make the step when they are fearing for their safety. And I think the option to report on fraud is very important. Also, the tool on the typology of fraud, I think, is very useful. We will touch upon these topics more in our question-answer part, but we'll continue with our presentations. And European Delegated Prosecutor Igor Gerasimins is going to present on the latest methods for identifying and preventing possible fraud when detecting and analyzing crimes that have caused or may cause damage to the EU financial interests. I think the next 15 minutes will be very interesting. Please, Mr. Gerasimins. Thank you, Artis. I hope you can hear me. Hello from Luxembourg, from the head office of the European Public Prosecutor's Office. We are currently in a training here in Luxembourg. We are originally situated in Latvia, so hello from Luxembourg. I will try to share my presentation with you. Yes, we can see your presentation. Yes, as you mentioned, my mission is to discuss and tell you about the latest methods for identifying and preventing possible fraud, analyzing information on the crimes that cause damage on the EU financial interests. I can say that European Public Prosecutor's Office, or EPPO, is not coming up with some kind of very original idea. We're just continuing previous work, but we have also our own perspective, our own way of work. Before I talk about the newest methods and algorithms, I would like to shortly give you an overview about the EPO, so you can understand why we have these methods, these algorithms, and why they work in our case. EPO is a new European institution. As I mentioned, our main central office is situated in Luxembourg, next to the European port. That's where I'm situated right now, but part of our colleagues and also me, myself, we are working in our national states. We are responsible for investigating and prosecuting financial crimes against EU financial interests. We are implementing and we are investigating and also indicting the charges. So we are, any case that is connected to the fraud, passing over to the court. The EPO is founded based on the regulation of EPO in 2017 to enhance mutual cooperation. Our operational work we started in 2021 in the 1st of June. So soon we will celebrate our half a year. We have a certain practice, we have weak points as new institution, but we are created from the start, from zero, so we have our challenges. We are talking about competencies, then broadly speaking, EPO's competencies are defined in the EPO directive regulation. If the fraud is to do with VAT, if these frauds are cross borders, then EPO gets involved, and if it's over 10 million euros. We are currently 22 member states that are within the EPO. We're looking for Sweden to join as well. So all the VAT fraud cases over 10 million euros are type of cases that EPO is working with. Regarding local cases or national cases, that is 10,000 euro cases or frauds. Of course, we have also other exceptions, how the case has impacted the EU as such, or there are other indicators. First, our goal is to protect all our taxpayers in Europe from any kind of tax fraud. In addition to the EU funds fraud, also any types of corruption where public officials on national or EU level are involved. So that is the overall scope, what we're doing. Here is what is the structure of the EPO. You can see that we have strategic and operational level. On strategic level, we have European Chief Prosecutor with 2 deputies. Then we have College of Prosecutors from 22 states. You know, from Latvia, we have Gatis Doriks representing Latvia. He is going to speak tomorrow in the conference. And then on operational level, we have permanent chambers of 3 members who are overseeing the work that we are doing, the European delegated prosecutors. So they are accepting or denying our actions that are defined in the regulation. Another thing that I didn't mention, that our base is the EPO or EPPO regulation, but regarding legislation, we are working in accordance with national laws and legislations, as long as it is not in conflict with the regulations of EPPO. Another aspect that is missing from this slide is that when we're talking about European Public Prosecutor's Office, there are two levels: central, where we have the central apparatus here in Luxembourg, and decentralized level, where are European delegated prosecutors who are situated in the member states, who are doing the actual work on or so-called handling prosecutors. There are 96 prosecutors. Slovenia just now had new candidates, but the final number is not finalized. Overall, we should have 140 prosecutors. In Latvia, we have 4 prosecutors delegated on European level. But this number is going to change with time. Talking about our cooperation partners, that's of course is European Anti-Fraud Office or OLAF, that is Eurojust, Europol, and also other institutions on national level, national prosecutors' offices. I like the thesis previously mentioned. I think it was Mr. Igors who said that we have to cooperate on different levels. And I think that is very crucial. We want to, of course, cooperate with European Commission and other EU institutions, including European Courts of Auditors, because we need their opinion in very specific issues of law and legislation. For example, yesterday we were visiting court yesterday, and we were giving advice to them. So these institutions that are shown in this slide is not finalized. There are more and more institutions that we are cooperating with. So this is the central issue. What are the newest methods or algorithms of the EPPO? Firstly, that is enhanced and mutual cooperation with national investigatory agencies and prosecutors' offices, national audit authority, with OLAF, Eurojust, and other EU institutions. So mutual enhanced cooperation. Of course, I don't have such resources to have an investigation and do all the investigation actions to analyze all the information. Don't have all the digital tools. Because of course, as digital data grows, the artificial intelligence has to be involved in investigations. I have to say thank you to the Anti-Corruption Office, to the State Police, to the Customs and other law enforcement institutions who are already now cooperating with us, because these institutions are the operational people, professionals. They are the ones who are doing the actual analysis. Thank you to the National Prosecutor's Office for giving us physical tools, offices, and on international level, we are happy for all the help that we are receiving from different institutions. And another that I want to mention is that the audit authority that we are cooperating with, we are cooperating very tightly with the audit office and also the institutions that are administering EU funds. We believe that this enhanced mutual cooperation is key to our work. I will give you a broader explanation why on the next slide, but this algorithm that the EPPO has chosen is to have a contact person to every institution that we are cooperating with. So the communication can be also very unofficial, so our cooperation grows more tightly. Also, EU institutions, OLAF, Eurojust, European Commission, and other EU institutions are the ones that we want to have enhanced cooperation. How the cooperation is organized, I have on purpose used the image of puzzle that we each separately make a whole picture. And that is the principle of sincere cooperation that is the basis of our cooperation. If we look also at the text of the regulation, what I mentioned before, that the cooperation has to be enhanced and mutual. If we look at the forms of cooperation, then on one hand, that's the formal cooperation, for example, within the criminal procedures, for example, between different institutions, for example, OLAF or national institutions, then this is on one hand formal cooperation that we are doing right now and are going to continue. Also, the text of the regulation sets that the OLAF is the cooperation partner of EPPO. Another cooperation form is not only within the criminal prosecution and criminal cases, but outside of it, that's informal cooperation, any kind of information that we can pass to other institutions, sharing any materials, trainings. That's what already Olga Guza mentioned about methodological materials that can be used in future for supervising institutions and us, so that the cooperation would be based on set rules. Another thing about enhanced cooperation, another important thing is feedback that we receive. Last time when we met with the representatives of OLAF, then of course when we have a criminal process in EPO, then OLAF shouldn't do once again their administrative actions or their processes. But If, for example, we can't continue with our criminal case, then we have to share any information with OLAF to help them with their cases. Similarly, with other institutions. Mr. Gerasimins, you have 1 minute left. So, shortly, I have an example about the conflict of interest. I have particularly chosen this image with a little blanket over people. That is one thing that we see, and the other pictures that other institutions see. And I think us as these pieces of puzzle, different institutions, we can support and broaden the view what we see regarding cases, regarding the situation of fraud. Another algorithm is that we want to have proactive approach to investigations, that we take part earlier in cases. Therefore, cooperation is crucial. That we can detect any red flags already earlier. And earlier we get involved, the better the case can be proved, because most of the time we have to conclude that the investigations are happening post factum and it is more difficult to prove them. And another thing is about direct cross-border cooperation, that we can pass information and receive back feedback. This centralized and decentralized system where the delegated prosecutors are in certain member states means that I can use our management system, I can call my colleagues, I can request for any actions, and that is a time-saving way that we are decentralized but still working as a one whole mechanism. Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too long in my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gerasimins. We will meet a bit later after the presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the European Delegated Prosecutor, Mr. Igors Gerasimins. We will continue. We will have a video recording by Mr. Constantine Palicarsky, UNDOC representative. He will speak about tasks and the setup to identify and detect the risks of fraud.
Allow me to start my presentation by thanking the organizers of the workshop for inviting the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to contribute to this very important topic. My presentation today will focus on identification and detection of the risk of fraud and the methodology that UNODC is using to that effect.
Narkotiku noziedzības pārvaldes labās prakses, krāpšanas risku identificēšanai un atklāšanai. Sākšu ar mūsu galveno dokumentu, konvenciju pret korupciju. Tas sniedz mandātu. ANO konvencija pret korupciju tika parakstīta 2003. gadā un spēkā no 2005. gada. Šobrīd tas ir globāls antikorupcijas standarts, kas nodrošina ietvaru starptautiskiem centieniem. Tam šobrīd jau ir 188 iesaistītās puses.
Focusing on the issues of prevention, criminalization, enforcement, international cooperation, and recovery of assets, which is a fundamental principle of the Convention and a real novelty in the world of anti-corruption. Now, what UNCAC does not have
kas nav mūsu ietvarā. Tā nav korupcijas definīcija. Saprotams, ka līdz ar 188 dalībniekiem panākt vienošanos par to, kas ir korupcija, ir sarežģīti. Ne tik daudz kultūrālu iemeslu dēļ, bet juridisku iemeslu dēļ. Tā vietā konvencija sniedz pārkāpumu sarakstu, kas tiek uzskatīts par korupcijas pārkāpumiem.
And these corruption offences include active and passive bribery of national, foreign, international public officials,
aktīva un pasīva publisko amatpersonu kukuļošana, iesavināšanās, tirzniecība ar ietekmi, funkciju ļaunprātīga izmantošana, kukuļošana, piesavināšanās privātajā sektorā, pārkāpumu slēpšana, kas ir daļa no 3. panta, bet parasti nav ietverta šajā listē. Tie ir arī naudas atmazgāšanas jautājumi, nelegāli iegūt līdzekļu legalizēšana un citi. Ņemot vērā faktu, ka konvencija pret korupciju apskata korupciju ļoti specifiskā veidā, mēs organizācijā aplūkojam riskus specifiskā veidā. Mūsu izpratnē korupcija ir notikums, pasākums. Tas nav par sistēmu vājībām vai procedūru vājumu. Tas ir fakts, kukuļošana, savu funkciju ļaunprātīga izmantošana.
Could affect negatively our organization, its budget, its effectiveness, and the trust of the public. Now, this is important because this is one major difference in the way we approach identification of risks in our methodology. Because corruption is treated as an event, it is a very specific way of defining the risk, and we need very specific ways of detecting the risk. Some of the factors to consider, of course, would always include the social and cultural aspects in the environment where the organization operates, including acceptability of corruption and loyalties. To what extent the business people in the country are employing corrupt business practices, employing corruption as a business tool. What is the level of technological development in the country and in the organization? What is the legal environment? How are the stakeholders interacting? These are all very important issues which really need to be paid attention to. But we also like to focus on the specifics. When we speak about risk of bribery, it's not just an abstract consideration. It's the risk that someone with whom the organization may be dealing could offer a direct or an indirect bribe to a staff member of the organization. When we speak about embezzlement, it's all about people stealing from the organization or using fictitious invoices from fictitious companies to transfer money to their own accounts or to accounts of their accomplices. Overpayment of bills, using organization resources for personal purchases, or at rare occasions using ghost employees, ghost workers to commit payroll-related fraud. When we speak about the risk of abusive functions, we are looking at specific violations of the existing rules for the benefit of oneself. And that benefit is usually financial, but it doesn't have to be only financial. And it's important to underline that that violation could be both an act or a mission to act. Same with trading in influence. In case if that is one of the risks that we identify, it has to be clear what do we mean by it It's essentially the promise, offering or giving to a public official or any other person undue advantage in order for that official or that person to abuse a real or supposed influence over another official, to obtain from the administration or a public authority undue advantage. So, with that said, where are the risks? Okay, the risks are events in the future. They are associated with these corruption offenses that could be found in Chapter 3 of the Convention. But where are the risks? Well, according to our approach to corruption risk management, the risks could be identified at essentially 3 levels. The first 2 levels, the organizational and process level, it's all about the specific corruption schemes that are taking place inside the organization. And the identification of corruption risks involves actually identification of corruption schemes. What we need to do first, what we're trying to do first when applying our methodology, is to identify the ways in which our organization has been defrauded in the past. This is a major source of information on how corruption had happened, and we all know that if something happened in the past, it is quite likely that it also may happen in the future. In order to obtain that information, we're looking at audit reports, we're looking at records of past convictions, we're looking at disciplinary proceedings, we're looking at investigation documents. The goal is to identify how corruption has happened in the past in order to understand how it could happen in the future. The next stage would be to link the identified corruption schemes to organizational processes and procedures. The reason why we want to do that is to understand what exactly procedure in the organization had been violated, and that directly gives us an idea what could be done in order to stop that corruption risk from happening. We could change that procedure. If there is no procedure, we could establish a procedure. It is very important to consider that particular stage, because otherwise, if we don't link the corruption risks to organizational procedures, we would not know what exactly we need to improve, what exactly we need to fix in order for corruption to corruption risks, to mitigate the corruption risks. Essentially, if you allow me to give an example, in case if we identify that a typical corruption scheme in our organization is that companies are colluding and are submitting bids that are not effectively independent, that they are inflating their prices, so and taking turns or in some other way are trying to influence the procurement process. A very specific step to stop that from happening would be to have a simple tool, for example, a database of market prices or something similar, that would allow us to identify inflated prices. And then once we have an indication that a certain price is hugely inflated, even in the presence of formal competition, then we start asking ourselves questions. Why the prices that we received, why the financial offers that we received were so high? A possible option is that they were high because of an attempt to commit fraud, and then we take action. However, It is also important that we need to look at individuals. And in our methodology, we are always suggesting to organizations that we work with to look at individuals that are in a higher risk of corruption. Individuals where there is conflict of interest, where there is weakened integrity, where there is identified perceived need or greed. And very often this is described with a classic tool of which, of course, no doubt you have all heard and you use it in your daily work, the fraud triangle. It's a mechanism, a description of how individual decides to commit fraud or corruption. Essentially that happens in presence of an opportunity. A person has access to decision-making, money, power, financial resources, under pressure, perceived need or greed. And then when a person rationalizes corruption, essentially it is rationalization is an important element. Rationalization is when a person basically says to himself or herself, well, it's not a real bribe really, it's just a gift, or everybody does it, or if I don't do it, someone else will do it, so I'd better do it because I need the money. When these three factors come together, fraud, corruption as one of the forms of fraud is much, much more likely to happen. And there are some behavioral patterns which could be used as red flags for fraud. Some of the patterns are shown on the display in front of you. Indebtedness, when a person often borrows money, including from colleagues, and essentially not from banks, not the regular way, but in a way that is difficult to explain. Excessive drinking or drug abuse or gambling. Why? Because these are all vices that may be expensive, that at some point require money, and the salary of that official may simply not be sufficient to cover the expenses. Easily annoyed when questioned about why they did something or they didn't do something, providing unclear, unreasonable responses to very clear and simple questions. People who are not allowing others to access the documents they've been working on. People who have history of abusing organization resources or want to be involved in processes that are not theirs, that should not be in their terms of reference. These are all indicators that we may pay attention to when we speak about red flags of corruption. Now, essentially, our methodology, which is outlined in the document State of Integrity, a guide to conducting corruption risk assessments in public sector organizations, available on the UNODC website. Our methodology calls for answering simple questions, but answering them completely. Who could commit fraud? Person at what level, involved in what processes, where they could commit the corruption act or fraud, in terms of a location, but also in terms of a process. What exactly could be stolen and how and when? And now, when we have the answer to those questions, we have a clear description of a scheme that could take place in the future, and we're able to stop it from happening. For example, by removing the person from that specific process, or by changing the location of where a process takes place, by simply protecting our assets more effectively, buying a new safe. If somebody's trying to steal the money from us, simple solutions work best. And generally answering all these questions is what enables us to be specific in our anti-corruption responses and to identify our corruption risks properly and take effective mitigating measures. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like once again to encourage all of you to have a look at the webpage of UNODC, where you could find a lot of interesting resources on that and other issues related to corruption. Thank you for your attention.
Paldies, paldies Konstantīnam
Thank
Palicarsky.
you to our speaker from UNDOC representative. I think he was very well identifying few of the red flags regarding fraud, and those are very practical ways how we could identify the red flags. Once again, in the chat or comment section, you can write your questions to all our speakers. After all the speeches, we'll have a short answer and question-answer section. So let's move forward to our next presentation, and now OLAF representative intelligence analyst Alessandro Angelini.
Okay, thank you, Artis, for the floor. I take for granted that you hear me, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. As you know very well, the pandemic has hit hard on the EU economy and society. And during the outbreak, the EU response has been strong and timely. EU funding was directed where it was most needed, for example, to support the health systems and the unemployed. A common vaccine strategy was built. Protective equipment was delivered. Supplies were bought together, faster and at a cheaper price. The EU civil protection mechanism got in motion. The first stockpile of medical equipment was created, etc., etc. Then the EU took decisive action to shape Europe's post-coronavirus future. The Recovery and Resilience Facility provides the member states with nearly 700 million euros, or even more than 700 million euros, to be invested by 2026 on agreed priorities. This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to emerge stronger from the pandemic, transform the EU economies, and create new opportunities and jobs. But there is another side of the coin, and the focus of my speech is on the potential impact of COVID-19 on the expenditure of public funds, in particular, but not only EU funds. To approach such a complex topic, I choose two keywords: emergency and acceleration. With emergency, I'm making reference to the period during the COVID outbreak when the absolute priority was saving lives and supporting the economy and the society deeply affected by restrictions. In such a situation, public support was increased and may have been provided through simplified procedures, which are usually allowed in the case of urgency. For example, this may have applied to the procurement of supplies, works, services during the first outbreak, or to get prepared to the following waves. But when urgency or emergency can be invoked, it is easier for fraudsters to get EU funding or public funding in general. The risk of conflict of interests and corruption increase because of time pressure and because of less competitive procurement procedures, such as negotiated procedures without publication, direct awards, also as additional contracts to current contractors, and so on. There is also a risk that these simplified procedures are used when the necessary conditions are not or are no longer in place. And when they're in place, there is a risk that the contracting authorities do not respect even these simplified rules. For example, in terms of keeping the necessary audit trail, which is key for ex post investigations. And during an emergency, such as the COVID pandemic, this happens in a situation of strong demand for certain products, for example, protective equipment or medical equipment in general, while the offer is more rigid than demand, at least in the short run, and supply chains get disrupted. And this in a context where fraudsters may build artificially long supply chains, including through shell companies, blurring the identification of the producer or fake or substandard products. And these products may be covered by certificates attesting the required quality that are fake, misleading, issued by entities that are not authorized for that. All of this increases the risk of entering into a contractual relationship with unreliable or insufficiently vetted counterparts, with related risks in terms of no delivery, not correct implementation, etc., etc. And these risks can impact the EU budget also because of operations funded retrospectively. Exceptionally, this was allowed during the COVID crisis. Basically, these are operations that are admitted to EU funding after they have been implemented. And this, of course, increases the amount of the EU funding spent during the emergency and brings to the award of funding to operations implemented outside the accredited management and control systems. Still with reference to implementation, the COVID crisis may lead to fraudulent beneficiaries or contractors that may invoke the COVID outbreak to falsely justify non-compliance with their contractual obligations, even if no or incomplete implementation was already part from the start of the fraudulent scheme. And the COVID crisis may even be used to mask fraudulent bankruptcies. But let's look at the COVID crisis also from the perspective of the increased pressure on the managing and control authorities. Delays in the ongoing operational programs due to the pandemic, new needs related to emergency spending, the start of the next programming period, including the Recovery and Resilience Facility, can be stress factors to the advantage of fraudsters. Fraudsters, for example, abusing conflict of interest, or even using networks of companies, possibly including shell companies, for example, offering the same services in multiple projects, inflating costs through fake intra-network transactions, simulating competition in procurement procedures, etc., etc. Pressure may also add to the challenge of assessing applicants' declarations for the selection of projects, which often do not have to be supported by complete evidence. And this makes this assessment even harder, especially when time is short. This increases the risk of inflated costs and of funding to companies that do not have the necessary financial and operational capacity, which at a later stage can translate in no implementation. And pressure may have led to a decrease in the quantity and quality of controls, also hampered by travel restrictions. Fraud detection becomes more difficult as controls are done remotely. And in most cases, direct access to staff, systems, and records is necessary, is key to fraud detection. But now, let's turn our eyes more towards the future, where the recovery and resilience facility definitely shape the path ahead of us. And this brings me to the second keyword, acceleration. The Recovery and Resilience Facility allows the member state to significantly increase public investment and requires that this public money is spent in a short period of time. On top of that, this money must be spent in specific sectors and in innovative interventions to support green and digital transitions. In general, the risks will depend on the type of intervention. For example, if the intervention will require the selection of projects, it will be exposed to the usual risks related to calls for proposals. And this includes, for example, the selection of projects or beneficiaries that do not satisfy the eligibility criteria, in particular without the necessary financial and operational capacity. The selection of projects that are already financed by other public funds or other EU funds. Here, there is a clear risk of overlapping with what has already been funded during the past programming period, 2014-2020, and what will be funded during the current programming period, 2021-2027. 2021-2027. Then you have a risk of the overestimation of costs in the application for funding. And then, after the project is selected, it may not be implemented as agreed. And costs during the implementation may be inflated. For example, as I mentioned, through fake transactions between companies belonging to the same group of fraudsters. These are all examples of risks that are related to the selection and implementation of projects. But then the intervention could require public procurement. And in this case, it will be also exposed to other known risks. And these risks cover, for example, the pre-tendering phase, which may lead to restrict competition to the advantage of certain tenderers. The tendering phase, including the collusion among bidders, as it was mentioned, or the post-tendering phase, in particular, changing the contract after the award, and the implementation shortcomings. Then, public procurement could be for one large project or for many projects scattered throughout the member state and managed by many contracting authorities. And these many contracting authorities may have different levels of administrative capacity, may be nearer to the potential beneficiaries, which may have consequences in terms of risks of conflict of interests, collusion, or simply complacency. And these many contracting authorities may operate in different contexts possibly infiltrated by organized crime. And if projects are to be selected through calls for proposals, so these projects, then the risks related to public procurement add to the risks related to project selection and implementation. In the case of the implementation of the recovery and resilience plans, then performance is particularly important because the disbursement of the EU funds is allowed by the achievement of milestones and targets. I'm speaking of the disbursement from the EU to the member state. And this adds another layer of risk related to the reporting and aggregation of the deliverables. For example, the chain of beneficiaries may provide inaccurate or even false information on the achievement of milestones and targets. In the case of investments based on many projects by many implementing bodies, there is also a risk that the aggregation process produces inaccurate results. Now, all these risks point to vulnerabilities that can be exploited by fraudsters. And the capacity of fraudsters to exploit these vulnerabilities is boosted by a number of enabling factors, such as the capability to use corruption, to abuse conflict of interest, collusion, the availability of networks of companies, the production and use of false documents and statements, etc., etc. And it must also be considered that the amounts at stake will attract organized crime, which has the capability and has the intention to defraud public funds. Now, starting from the awareness about the general risks related to the general type of intervention, a specific fraud risk assessment is necessary for each intervention to understand the specific risks related to its own peculiarities and the national management and control frameworks of reference.
If we could ask you, Mr. Angelini, to finish up in a minute or two, though.
Yes. Now I would like to close my speech with two general reflections. First, risks could increase if the member states, to ensure the use of funds by 2026, undermine the delicate balance between keeping the requirements to the minimum to simplify access to the funding and keeping the requirements to a satisfactory level for fraud prevention and detection purposes. Second, there is always a risk that projects or operations of dubious effectiveness, efficiency, economic value get funded, also because of pressure to spend. The sudden increase in resources brought by the Recovery and Resilience Facility can create or increase a mismatch between the funding offer on the one side and the projects that the market, the society can propose in the short run. And this may worsen problems of funds absorption and can be exploited by fraudsters. In the case of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, pressure could be even higher because minimum percentages of expenditure are to be made in specific sectors, such as green investments, digital transition, etc. And because massive support to innovative projects, which makes more difficult on the one side to find a great number of valuable proposals shouldered by adequate knowledge, skills and resources. And on the other side, to assess the value of the proposals, the cost estimations and statements, the adequacy of output. To conclude, the COVID-19 crisis has an impact on fraud risks because of the emergency it created and the acceleration in investments it requires. And because fraudsters have the capability and the adaptability to exploit the situation. So, The fight against fraud and corruption must be kept high and visible in the EU and in the member states' agendas. I finished with my presentation. I hope I stayed in my 15 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Angelini, for your presentation and for the many valuable examples. And of course, yes, the COVID situation has definitely impacted the way that processes have happened, and maybe we have the chance to talk this over in the question and answer session. So thank you right now. Dāmas un kungi, teiksim, paldies pagaidām OLAF informācijas analītiķim Alessandro Angelini, un parunāsim ar viņu iespējams arī jautājumu atbildu sadaļā.
So now we would like to thank Alessandro Angelini. We also kindly invite you to send in the questions and in the chat. And now we will listen to the last presentation on the internet fraud phenomenon. It will be done by the Deputy Head of the State Police Administration, Mr. Dmitrijs Homenko. Welcome. Good afternoon, participants of the conference, colleagues, cooperation partners. It's my honor to participate and represent State Police Administration today. I will try to share my presentation. As you might have noticed, the subject of my presentation is phenomenon of telecommunication frauds and possible preventive solutions. This is something that has become on our agenda more and more. Recently, involves different parties. We are looking also for support from state institutions. Prior to discussing the problems themselves, we have to understand the overall scale. We have seen that the internet accessibility in our country already in 2020 received almost 90% of our households. We have 1,400,000 users or real users, and significant numbers of users also use the global network. These are potential victims, and of course, this is the background for internet frauds. We use more than 2.2 million unique devices, which are the potential victims from virtual fraudulence. But prior to begin to speak about the statistics, I would like to provide a bit comparative outlook, how to perceive the virtual space nowadays. Can we imagine that virtual space, these are virtual ways where we can move on a daily basis? Up to 1.4 million population drive virtual cars. And if you think about classical roads, unfortunately, we do not have such a strict regulation as it is for road transport and the rules to be obeyed. It means the virtual routes, it's hard to monitor them from the state side, and these are the commerciants who are monitoring this virtual space. And we need innovative solutions how to protect our population in the virtual space. To continue the same analogy, virtual movement against physical movement. then in practice, state takes care of the participants. There are signs, also rules how to behave on the roads. So there are institutions who take care of these aspects and to make this movement safer. But as representatives of the police, we haven't identified an institution who would be obliged to take care of our population's virtual traffic and movement, the usage and rules. And I think it quite significantly impacts the statistics, the bad statistics. I will tell you shortly. If we look at data in the period 2019-2020, we can see clear decrease in the beginning of pandemic. During COVID-19, it has increased more than 15%. The data for this year will be available in the beginning of next year. But at this stage, we can also say that at this stage, the cases detected is more than 200% higher than it was previously. This is something we try to characterize and explain in the next slides, how it's done, how the criminal offenses violations have developed, and what are the possible solutions. Speaking about fraudulent activities, we speak about fraudulent frauds that has been committed in the virtual space using ICT. And that's why the next slide will be related to the developments of telecommunication fraud phenomenon. And I will describe the most popular telecom fraud types, which also are the main during the last 3-4 years. Why ICT? ICT solutions. Why it has become so popular during the last years? This is linked to the pandemic, also with the virtual developments. We work remotely, our children study remotely. So significantly, the number of users of internet has increased. Previously, we had more meetings in person, meetings at work. We worked physically on site. I would say these are direct consequences that we have become more virtual, more remote, and dependent from ICT. But in any emergency situation, we didn't have time to prepare, to inform, to educate our society, and in order to prevent from these risks. And as a result, there is this increase. If we go back to pre-pandemic times, the phenomenon number one was so-called false brokers, investment platforms. So these are callers using mobile telephone calls. And during their communication, they have suggested to invest financial means in some kind of investment platform and promising benefits and good results. It has developed and it's still valid nowadays. There are there's different spectrum, but certainly it has developed. A bit later, there will be a separate slide on this as well. At this stage, state police has the information about the total loss of 2.6 million euros, unfortunately. Unfortunately, these are losses not for the enterprises, for the corporations, but unfortunately, Behind every episode, there is a victim who has lost his savings, he has taken credit, and this money has been something he or she has been saving during his lifetime, and has been saved for important purchases or later years. So in the center, there's a person, his story, and that's very painful, the result of fraud. To proceed with phenomenon number 2, it appeared that at the end of 2020, these are so-called false buyers who have defrauded data from credit cards, smart ID data, these are DPD, Omniva type web pages with the aim to get the data from the buyers and later get the money from their accounts or to make any activities. These losses are not so significant because there were proposals to buy not very expensive items, and taking account the low quality and the victims. So we can see very clearly 150,000 euros is the current amount of loss we have received also. And the phenomenon number 3, and still continues with some trend of 2 degrees. There are some people pretending via telephone conversation to be representatives of credit institutions, banks, and this is the way how very fast, like in 10 minutes, they manage to get around the person's account, savings, to transfer the money in a couple of minutes. The person gets psychologically affected, impacted, and the fraud takes place. This amounts to 6 million euros. If we proceed with separate phenomenon, so the first is false brokers, investment platforms. So I would say that this phenomenon and other 2 are of international nature. We've had significant investigations, and we have had 2 internationally organized crime groups. There are at least, for one of the groups, it's at least 21 criminal processes. The loss 300,000 euros. We investigate these processes jointly with our European colleagues. Also, people from other European countries are involved, and they have used more than 85 false financial platforms on the internet. So these are fake areas where the fraud has taken place. The second international organized group has done even bigger harm. In our country, we have identified 121 criminal proceedings. Investigation is ongoing. We work together with our European colleagues. We can see that Latvia is not the only target country. Also, other countries are involved with larger losses. But in our country, 121 criminal processes and victims. The loss is 2.3 million euros. It shows really the damage, what can be done and is done by these frauders, international frauders. I would like also to develop a bit more on the development on this phenomenon. We can see that first level is the level when the victims are approached via phone. So they basically capture people who respond. So losing their first savings, they unfortunately get into the second level of fraud. They receive calls from some kind of virtual institutions promising to recover their losses. And in 2021, we also realized that these people managed to get captured in this third level. So basically, the frauders call them. They pretend to be representatives of important European level institutions and promising really to recover their assets. And unfortunately, we have these cases. And we will continue a bit faster, given the time limits. Going to the second phenomenon. These are the fraud cases related to DPD Omniva, so delivery services. It's 37,000, a bit more than 37,000 for Omniva. And these are 171 cases where people have informed the state police. The second case, illegal usage of DPD logo. We have 536 cases. So it means we have significant increase, at least 700 more cases, according to the previous years. We can see that in all these three phenomena, the communication is carried out in Russian language. And we can state that these frauders are not located in Latvia. They are coming from neighboring country. That's a highly organized crime. It has spread it already through across a number of countries. And coming back to the phenomenon number 3, which is the largest. So the frauds via telephone, people representing them as credit institution representatives. We can see that we have had 778 violations. The total loss is a bit more than 6 million euros. It's not a secret that virtual frauds can falsify the number of the bank, which makes it easier to speak to the potential victim. He uses the Russian language. There is psychological impact. The person receiving the call comes into a stress situation. He's being initiated to make so-called the right step, but unfortunately, it means to lose the money for fraudulent reasons, and unfortunately, a person provides personal data. That's very shortly on the phenomenon. Now on the suggested solutions. Initially, I spoke about virtual roads, virtual channels, about encouragements, signs, warnings. I think we have to think at state level about virtual roads, virtual channels, how to organize it, how to manage it. And now it's being developed. So to develop this internet tool, meaning that all the requests go through commercial representatives, and technical specifics allows for them to cooperate with the surveilling institutions. They can inform, not to block, but to inform proactively the users that attending, for example, web page corruption.com, it might be fraudulent. And at state level, there are institutions which have registered different negative reporting on this domain. We do not want to limit the internet accessibility, and that's against the idea itself, but to inform and to warn our users. That's our intention. Of course, with this warning, we also provide the opportunity for this user to contact the institution maintaining this domain, also to get the additional information, why this warning has appeared. This is the concept itself, not the technical details, but that's a very simple mechanism we can implement, and we have already positive examples, and we can see that this solution works, is working already actively since 2018. To show how this instrument works, this tool works, we started project IWOL, which is blocking tool, in 2019. We speak about dissemination of materials related to children's sexual harassment. And since 2018, all the internet users are blocked by international institutions like Interpol. So basically, the access is blocked. And since 2018, we have blocked more than 4.5 million attempts for Latvian population to access this type of domains, information. So technically, this tool works. It doesn't harm, doesn't violate the overall integrity of the internet. It's a preventive tool, which I think it's the right time to implement. And the state police has taken a kind of leading role with this respect. We look for the partnership at state level, at public sector, also at NGO level. In order to fight, to combat telecom frauds with the help of this tool. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Es domāju, ka esam palielam iekļaujušies arī mums
I
atvēlētajā
think we are following our time frame, and we will continue with our questions and answers. I would like to invite all the speakers of our panel discussion to turn on your cameras. And if you have any comments, please raise your hand so we can have a small discussion. we had in this discussion two main fraud types. Firstly, more type towards private persons, and secondly, fraud against public procurements. Let's continue with the fraud against individuals. We have a question. How can you inform people on telephone fraud as most of the phone numbers are so similar? How can you inform people more effectively? That's a good question. In this particular phenomenon, the informative tool is not the most effective. As we see, each of the phenomena are developing, and we can't say that next fraud will be pretending to be an official of a state institution. One of the methods that were used was fishing or moving to a fake page where to do the fake dealings. We do believe that these phenomena are going to develop. Another question to you, Mr. Homenko, maybe about features, how to recognize fraud. We have heard about it in media. You mentioned also about language, how fraudsters are talking to people, and maybe some other red flags that we would recognize fraud, so we would understand that it's fake or real. What would be the three top features? Yes, language is one thing, but what if they speak in state language? I can say that all the tries or cases where the state language is used are already in view of the state police. One situation is language, secondly is stress situation. Starting from the first sentence, the caller is trying to create a stress situation. Your money is going to get lost, something horrible is going to happen, or something is already happening, and we are here to help you. That is a red flag that the stress situation is created. Another red flag that we can mention is invitation to take your password, your PIN code, your passwords, and that is a red flag. You put your phone down and inform the police. Thank you. Very good suggestions. I think we all should take them into account as the fraud is becoming more creative. And that is also the next part of our conference, where we'll talk more about technologies. But what about methods that are not based on creating a stress situation, but rather connected to public procurement? Let's start with Mr. Angelini about longer processes connected to state institutions. You mentioned the COVID-19 fraud risks. We had several presentations and several red flags were mentioned, but maybe you can give us once again what are these features, the red flags that we should pay attention to, that fraud is about to happen. Maybe also from the other side, if we look at the contractors who are trying to help with the agreement, how can they notice what, if the fraud is about to happen?
Yeah, thank you for the floor. But red flags related to public procurement can be a lot and can be linked to the different phases of public procurement, starting from the pre-tendering phase, where you can see signs of a kind of tailorization of the tender documentation to a specific profile in order to favor, let's say, a favorite potential tenderer. And there, the irregularities themselves, administrative irregularities themselves, like having discriminatory qualification requirements or excessive technical specification, which are too narrow, unnecessarily referring to certain standards or even to specific brands. These are all signs of a tailoring in order to favor a specific tenderer, and then you may start wondering if it is linked then to conflict of interests, and then you can there you can have another sign that can pop up at the later stage, where you have that one of the tenderers, the loser tenderer, then pop up in a subcontract with the winning contractor. And here you are in the post-tendering phase. In the tendering phase, you can have other red flags where you see that the winner does not satisfy the qualification requirements. It can happen, even in a context where the qualification, maybe I'm going too fast, the qualification requirements were disproportionate and impeded participation by other potential tenderers. So, I mean, covering all the possible red flags is impossible in 1 minute, but I would like to pass the message that first, they can be linked to different phases of the public procurement: pre-tendering, tendering, and post-tendering. Then the issue is not only to have these red flags, but to pass from the red flag to the suspicion of fraud. And there you need a process putting together additional information. For example, you have to put into context the red flag. If the red flag is prices that are 3 times the normal prices, you have to review the whole procurement process. And maybe you see that these high prices are also linked to the fact that the technical specifications were very narrow, to the fact that only one bidder participated, the so-called phenomenon of single bidding. So you have to build the context in order to better assess if this indicator brings you to a suspicion of fraud that must be reported to the competent authorities for further investigation. And in this, it is very important to consider links. Links, for example, between contractors. The fact that the same contractor has committed an irregularity, an administrative irregularity, like winning a competition where the qualification requirements or the technical specification were very narrow. Does it happen, or did it happen also in other similar contracts? So was he involved in more than one contract where this or similar irregularities took place? You have to consider links between companies, also through shareholders and managers. So links is important. Context is important in order to put the red flag in context and get to the suspicion of fraud.
Paldies, Angelini kungs.
Mr. Angelini.
So I would like now to approach Mrs. Guza. And one of the things you mentioned was fraud typology. Maybe there are other popular red flags which we can identify while working on typology.
Jā,
Yes, indeed. I would like to mention a very simple red flag. Any financial recipient can check it. That's gathering information about your partners. When you are approaching signing the agreement, you can open Internet, Google, social networks, and really look up the information about your potential partner. And most likely there might be some red flags. For example, enterprise declares high professionalism, but you cannot verify this internet. You cannot verify the information on the internet. That might be falsified. It might be so-called postbox enterprise just to receive the financial means. You also have to look into the documents submitted, also for the monitoring institutions. They should have a look at the documents, also how the invoices are prepared, not including the necessary information. There are strange signatures, strange information about the institution. So basically, they do not comply with the requirements for application. And these are the things which we can identify. Thank you. Thank you for the examples provided on these red flags. I think many institutions are waiting for this typology. It will be a very practical and useful tool. Now I would like to approach Mr. Gerasimins. As I can see from the questions, there is of crucial importance the cooperation. And can you give also some examples working well? But maybe people listening from the side, this sounds somewhere in the sky. Maybe you could provide the main challenges between the perhaps institutions which we are currently facing, and basically is there a challenge? What's the problem if we speak about cooperation? I think that's a timely question. That's, of course, directly linked with the topic of this conference on the crowd immunity. The same as in medicine, the immunity against fraud, we can understand if we understand what we are fighting for or fighting against. And that's fraud. And fraud can be identified through irregularities or these fraud or these red flags. It doesn't mean that something very bad has happened, but it means that we need more analysis. For example, enterprise has applied for a procurement procedure which is not typical to his competence scope. And about this cooperation, the one thing I can clearly see initially, the monitoring institutions do their work. They identify these red flags. They add these typical situations when these flags are used. Then we make this link with exact criminal violations. It means if there's such a situation, there's criminal offense, a criminal violation, we can communicate. We have our own contact points. For example, if it's the Central Finance and Contracting Agency, they should call myself. We can organize a meeting where we discuss the exact case. We can act. Also, the methodological material provides the situations where we have to apply different institutions, at what stage and when. Red flags, they really depend from the stage we are in. It's important to note when the institution comes to us. And this is what we are trying to achieve by the material. It's not that we received information, there's not enough information, and then we start some unnecessary communication between different institutions, and it decreases really the effectiveness. So I think the institutions have to understand the needs of different sides, and this is what we are trying to develop more at this stage. Thank you. So time flies, and I will just look into the questions we've received. I think that's to Mr. Homenko, a specific question, but that comes from social network, from Facebook. There are many job offers on Facebook in international organizations, and there is this requirement for Russian language knowledge. Is this the case when someone is trying to fraud money from individuals? I think for sure any invitation which somehow financially motivates to communicate the reader, and that's done through distant networks, it means we have several red flags. I cannot identify the method, but it can be simply getting bank data, it can be card data accessibility, it can be about defrauding your email details. But the thing we have to understand what the criminals need. These are personal data, what they need. They're being collected, they're being sold in different markets, also to other criminals. So basically data gathering is one of the stages when we speak about cyber crimes. And what is the real reason? We can know just when we start the communication. But I would like to say we work proactively in this direction as well. We are discreet also on social networks. And we also try to measure the segment, internet segment, what are the challenges, and how to approach the society to inform about preventive measures. Thank you. Thank you for your answer to the question sent in by our listeners. It's clear that key word we have heard is procurement process, cooperation between the institutions to determine the cases, to prevent the cases. And for me, as a person who's watching and listening these presentations, I think that quite reassures myself that we have this vision for future development, for future cooperation, to avoid these fraud possibilities at different levels. I would like to thank all the participants, Olga Guza, AFCOS LV representative, Igors Gerasimins, European Delegated Prosecutor, Constantine Palicarsky, UNDOC representative, and all the others. Thank you for the participation in the panel. Now we will have the lunch break until 2 o'clock Latvian time. We will be waiting you for the third panel, which will be more devoted to the technologies as a tool to detect and prevent the potential fraud. So another interesting part of the conference